All right, this meeting is being recorded. Okay, so the agenda is actually pretty short for today. I didn't really have, it's been a bit quiet. The most work that we're going to talk about, at least what we're working on, are the BoltDB shipper and alerting stuff. But anybody has anything else that they want to talk about or add or questions, feel free to pop them in at the bottom of the list. So Owen, you want to give us a quick update on how alerting is going?
Sure. So we merged alerting and have been running it in a number of different environments and basically cleaning up small bugs here and there. And then most of my work recently has been in the kind of Cortex and then some tooling that we have. There's a repository called Cortex Tools, which is a CLI used for interacting with the ruler, among other things. So basically pushing out changes to support LogQL in those respective places, because it's a lot more helpful if when we release alerting, we also have ancillary tooling to help people actually use it. So that's kind of the first stage. We are going to add a way to persist the metrics created during alerting by Prometheus as well. That's initially not included in the Loki distribution of alerting because we don't bundle a metric store at all. So a little bit of background, basically when you evaluate alerts, you persist a few metrics to back in Prometheus store, which makes sense if you're running Prometheus. Loki, it's a little bit trickier. So we do some kind of in-memory hacks to mitigate this problem. And then I'm probably going to first work on adding support for persisting metrics to a Cortex distribution, because that's just what we use internally, but definitely open to adding other backends there.
Nice.
So the alerting part, is it like literally alerting based on log lines, right?
So it's yes, but for metric queries based on them. So like count pipe grep, basically. Right? How many times what's the ratio of logs that contain error? And so there's kind of there's not that much surface area where this is actually useful, in my opinion. Just like this, right? Like you can grep for people leaking HTTP credentials, right? Things like that. But for this to become significantly more useful, we're probably going to need the LogQL v2 updates merge, which is being headed by Cyril when he comes back from, I think that's next week. I hope it's next week.
I believe
he comes back from his time off. So that's going to really elevate what we can do, because then you'll be able to arbitrarily generate and associate labels from log lines, and that'll open the door to a lot more opportunities here.
That makes sense, but I guess you work on the framework itself, so you can configure something like Prometheus alert rules, but with LogQL instead of.
Yeah. So the API is the exact same, right? With the distinction that we're just evaluating LogQL instead of PromQL, and then a kind of few messy internals, because we don't actually write series to Prometheus anywhere, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Super cool, because there are already existing tools for handling this API, creating those YAMLs, and mixins. So it's amazing we could kind of fit into this.
Thank you.
All right. So the BoltDB shipper, I threw another name out for this, but everybody shot me down. We need another branding for the BoltDB shipper is a new index type in Loki. It's not probably new for people that have heard me say this before, but to replace the requirement for a NoSQL store like DynamoDB or Bigtable, and instead use BoltDB and flush the BoltDB files to the object store. So I was going to call it single store Loki, but we got to work on that still. But effectively, we are running this now in our operations environment, which is a few terabytes a day of log volume. And the primary challenges so far have been on query performance. The initial deploy was sort of comically bad, but Sandeep has been doing some awesome work through compressing index files and the addition of a compactor, and I like it, Bartek. Actually, it's doing pretty good. So Sandeep, you want to give us an update on where we're at now and what's next?
Yeah, so we are doing about 2 TBs per day in that cluster, and we are running 2 parallel clusters, one using Bigtable and another using BoltDB Shipper. And we are replicating the writes to both the clusters so that they have same logs, and we are using a query T in front of it. So we compare the query performance and the query response. So the Bigtable cluster receives many more queries because we run Canary that points to it. So the query load is not the same, but for the queries that we are getting from Grafana are same and are getting compared. So for some of the queries, BoltDB Shipper is faster. For some of the queries, Bigtable is faster. So the queries which are slower are for recent data, for which the index is still with ingesters, and we have to query ingesters for the logs, and that is slow. So we want to change the approach to just query the index from ingesters and do the processing of logs in queryers itself, which is faster compared to ingesters. So that should also give us better performance. And currently, I can say the query performance is on par with Bigtable when we use BoltDB Shipper with 2 TBs of logs per day.
Awesome. Yeah, that's fantastic. It actually was a little quicker to get to those comparable performances than we expected. Yeah, the work next. So the sort of limitation now is, well, it's not a limitation, but it can be improved is a better way to say that, where the way that works, right, is the ingesters are creating these BoltDB files and then uploading them in a regular interval. And until they upload those files, they're the only knowledge of flushed chunks. So the queryers have to ask the ingesters, say, hey, give me the data for the chunks that you flushed, but that are part of the index you haven't shared with everybody yet. And that forces the ingesters to do querying like the queryers do, which then requires their memory usage to be increased. And as Sandeep says, performance is an issue too, because they're doing other things. So Sandeep's idea, which I like, is a good one, is rather than having the ingesters do the query and return the logs, we're going to add another API to the gRPC connection to just have them do the index lookup, so that you can ask the ingester, hey, just give me the chunk IDs for the chunks you flushed that you haven't shared yet, and then the queryers can download that data and process it separately. And that then removes a lot of that extra memory burden of having the ingesters do that lookup. So that should help close the gap there, as well as stop us from crashing our ingesters. That's pretty exciting. I think what we're hoping to do is get that experimental flag off of this, and I think we're going to probably be able to do so not too terribly long in the future, certainly with workloads similar to what we've tested on, and then in the long term, anybody that's familiar with what Cortex has been doing with the TSDB store conversion, we'll face some of these same problems eventually, where if you look orders of magnitude bigger and your index is now a terabyte in size, right? Like probably 2 orders of magnitude bigger than what we are now. So if you're doing like 100 terabytes of logs a day and you're shipping a 1 terabyte index, the download of that will become so that where we have to look into like a store gateway and sort of splitting and sharding that into chunks and or into separate memory components and those kinds of things I expect to come. But it's exciting that we won't need that for, I think, what are pretty reasonable workloads, and that, probably 1 to 10 terabyte a day, which covers, I think, a lot of people's use cases. So for those workloads, it doesn't look like we're going to have to do any kind of crazy, query splitting and caching, and not yet at least. But we will probably end up there anyway, just because there'll be performance gains for doing that too. Yeah, good stuff. Perry, you want to chat for a bit about the Loki Benchmarks project?
Yeah, sure. I have also to share a little bit my screen for that, because I mean, we have here 9 people at least, so we should make this, let's say, not over the voice. Let's give it a sec. I've created just 2 slides just for visualization, and I need only to digest Wayland sharing techniques again.
In the meantime, Ed, why Bolt Shipper is it a separate component? Cannot be embedded into the ingester directly, or it's actually that? You're muted, Ed.
Yeah, it's embedded in the services, queries and ingesters. The compactor is just a separate service, like how it's for Cortex and maybe for Thanos.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So, okay. Yeah. So just a code component. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, Pericles.
No, it's okay. You just need to give me the voice, because I cannot see you, so I don't know where you are. I just can only hear you currently. Okay, Loki Benchmarks, for some of you, this is not really new. Some of you work with me in the same company, that's why. But in general, we have this kind of very small flame started a couple of weeks ago in my team. We would like to have a tool to evaluate Loki besides Grafana Cloud, especially in our case for typical OpenShift cluster. So it means something. I have Loki running inside a cluster somewhere, and I want to stress test it, and I want to have, in general, for every time I run this stress tests or benchmarks, how we started to calling it, have a report and also discuss around this report and get some nice, let's say, insights. So basically, we started writing something around Ginkgo's benchmarking suite. So something like, how can we structure and write some things like BDD like benchmarks. And we came up with a simple repository out with which we call Loki Benchmarks, and it's just a small driver test suite where you say we throw this test again a Kubernetes cluster where you have Loki inside running. We collect some measurements through the metrics that Loki exports, and then we create just a simple report so that people can see what is running. So what we really currently support is really running Loki inside K8s. The benchmarking suite doesn't deploy this thing. It expects that you have somewhere Loki running. We do some couple of measurements around request duration, and we, let's say, you can install on this specific cluster a synthetic logger, which was based on serialist logger work months or years ago, which I had to bump a little bit. That is basically a prompt tail that gets synthetic log messages and sends them against Loki. And a small reader utility, so that you can do query ranges currently, and then you can collect samples from the metrics you have inside Loki and create a report out of it. So basically, Loki Benchmark is just only a runner. It's just something you can run from your machine, but it doesn't really do anything more than you point it to a Kubernetes cluster, you deploy there by giving the deployment manifest of the loggers you want to have and the readers. Currently, they are untainted, so they may land on the same nodes as your Loki cluster. And then we just run a local /Prometheus instance and just scrape over port forwarding the Loki metrics. This is just a simple thing, which we just collect the metrics over a sample period and sample interval, and then we just can export them currently to CSV, some GNU plot, and you get, let's say, a small, nice overview in Markdown. So the gist of it is basically, and I hope this is readable, this is basically the Loki Benchmark suite is something that you declare a config. It includes already two tasks, which we call one high volume reads and one high volume writes. But basically you declare what is your logger, what is your querier. This is basically something that you can come up and your own custom images here that know how to push and how to read from Loki. The metrics declaration part is here more how we want to scrape, how do we want to, not to scrape, to read metrics from Prometheus. And of course, you declare where Loki is. In my case, it's something in this test is something running inside kind. The scenarios are the most interesting part. You can basically create new tasks in this suite, and you can then declare them as scenarios. And there you can control things like how many samples do I want to take, at which range, what range should my rate queries get in, and on which interval I want to collect a sample. Same for writers. How many writers do I want to have? How many messages should they have as a throughput? And the readers are the same thing, where you can declare the query for query range currently, where you say, okay, I want to collect this amount of 1 hour data and then rate them, sum them, and produce something by level, something like that. The final thing is strat threshold. This is let's say a latch. Basically, when you run the test, and if you don't have a Loki with populated data, whom you may want to, let's say, start the writers first, wait until they have created enough amount of data, and then start your readers and collect metrics for your readers. So this is basically the whole thing. I call it demo time, but it's not really something to demo. It's just more showing where things are currently. So we have one repo. It's currently under one Red Hat organization called Observatorium. But we were talking already with Ed to migrate this to something more easy identifiable. Basically, this is the repo where you can add your tasks, contribute, and create things for your setup. And the whole gist is basically a small markdown which you can, let's say, transform to HTML. And something that you can, let's say, zip and give it to somebody else, or you can archive it to see what happened over days. But this is basically more a scratch of results, like, hey, I've done my benchmark, and I want to have, let's say, the results of my measurements. And since a little bit of CSV and GNU plot can work some nice images, we integrated that there. So you basically get here a hierarchical result, like you get for each component that plays into a test. You get, let's say, it's P99 or P50 and the average of the durations. And for example, in writes, I have only the distributor and the ingester. That's why I scrape only these metrics. However, if we go down to reads basically land on the query front end. I take measurements there on duration. Then they land on the queriers, and then they land again on the ingester. So you may wish to, let's say, do the tests from an end-to-end fashion, but you may want also to see what happens on each component when I do this high volume reads, as we call them currently. Yeah, and to finish this, I would like to call out some limitations. We are looking after contributions. The one thing that is, and this is probably the major blocker, this started as from our own demand to test Loki inside OpenShift clusters. So it is currently only working if you have Loki installed somewhere in Kubernetes. And there are a couple of other optimizations that could be nice to improve over time. Something you may want to configure prompt tail batch sizes from your logger perspective, or make the log entry generation more sophisticated, like not only sending synthetic messages or sending also more heavy messages like stack traces or JSON logs, or try other reader patterns like queries and tails. Maybe run partial benchmarks, and don't use a local Prometheus instance to scrape Loki. Use something that you have in your setup. So things like that. Yeah, tainted loggers is something if you want to benchmark something in true isolation, like you put Loki on a specific set of machines in your Kubernetes or whatever, and then you want to put your loggers and readers somewhere else. So basically, these are ideas that I'm coming up, improving this small thing and moving forward. For us, it's good enough to write new tests for our scenarios and test in OpenShift, but probably, for sure, it's not enough for you people. So I'm calling out to the community. If someone wants to contribute, reach out. There is a ton of work to do. So let me close the presentation and
Nice.
feel free to shoot questions.
That's awesome, Perry. Thank you. We talked a little bit about this earlier this week, and you know, this is an area too where we want to extend this for sort of non-Kubernetes testing too, as much as possible. But hopefully, what I'd love to see is a framework where people can basically benchmark Loki on their own hardware. We can sort of figure out how to aggregate those results. We get asked a lot, right, about how fast is Loki, or what about this scenario and setup? And we don't really have any benchmark numbers for that. So it would be nice to be able to enable the community to generate those as well as test things themselves. So that's a nice ultimate goal there, but that's a great start. So thanks very much for that work you've done so far. Before I move on to this logql, anybody have any questions on that? All right. So the logql v2 update is that I'm not quite ready to give an update yet. So we've kind of sat on it for a bit because Cyril's been on PTO. He's coming back next week, and we sort of yesterday started digging up some discussion. But in the process of doing so, I realized that probably should have dug this discussion up sooner. But some of the stuff that we haven't decided on yet, I'm a bit concerned about a kind of a too many cooks problem if we open it up to a wider community. Because honestly, like the decision needs to be made sort of, I don't know, maybe just by a rough consensus, because it's going to be picking between like two words, and it's going to be hard to have what I'm seeing so far is I don't know that anybody's going to have like a more logical argument. So I'm worried that if we add too many people to the doc until we kind of narrow down some of those more ambiguous decisions, it's just going to be more people presenting different logical arguments that don't really have any more bearing or weight. That too many cooks is what I'm calling that in the kitchen. So next week, I think we'll do, when Cyril's back or shortly thereafter, there's a small group of, I think, 5 stakeholders that are looking at the design. And once we get that, these couple last things figured out, we will publish a version of that for people to look at. And I imagine at that point, Cyril will probably update his proof of concept and hopefully get us something that we can play around with a bit and be on our way to having the ability to extract labels at query time, which is going to be, especially with what Owen said, and in general, a huge advantage. I did want to call this out because I really like this, but I don't have the PR handy. But recently merged into Grafana was a way when you're in Explore to if you're using JSON or log format to select and view individual, so the Grafana does some client-side parsing of the response, and if it recognizes the format of the logs, it allows you now to select individual components. This is nice, particularly for sort of big JSON documents, but I'm also using it a lot now with log format, where a lot of times I don't care about the elements. I only really want to know something like latency or throughput, and you can go in and select those now. I don't know if that's in a released version of Grafana yet. I think that it probably is.
No, it's not. It's going to come out in 2, which will be end of September.
Gotcha. All right, so I teased you guys too early, unless you have a master build or a nightly build that you're working from. But I think this is exciting because we have the master build running internally, and I've been using it. But only a couple minutes left. Does anybody have anything else? Questions, comments, concerns? I'd like to see more people. Thanks for showing up, everybody. Again, I did a really bad job of promoting this. Yesterday, I was going to do some Twittering and poke this around a little bit more, but forgot because I'm bad at that. Nonetheless, though, glad to see some more people here. I definitely want to encourage this. This is not really developer focused. We just want people using Loki, operating, running. Tell your friends if you have questions. Just want to know what's going on. Yeah, once a month. First Thursday of every month. All right, thanks everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.